Coming to you from Brick House in downtown Brooklyn, this is 112 BK. On the show today, the BQE desperately needs repairs, and a state assembly member will tell us how soon we can expect them. And helping Brooklyn youth deal with gun violence. Hi, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Ashley Ford. Now, New York State doesn't have the death penalty. That's good, but it's still legal in 31 states. Most don't carry it out, but some still do, like Texas, Ohio, Florida, Alabama, and Oklahoma. In fact, Alabama just had a botched execution last month. They couldn't find a suitable vein in which to inject the lethal drugs. They tried, in vain, excuse the pun, for several hours, leaving the inmate a bloody mess, according to his lawyers. But finding a vein isn't the biggest problem for executioners. It's finding the drugs. Since states have decided the most humane way of executing a human is by lethal injection, the fatal concoction has involved a cocktail of 3 drugs. But one of the essential drugs, the one that renders the condemned unconscious, has been in short supply. Why? Well, that's one good thing about capitalism. When death penalty opponents raised awareness that the drugs of certain pharmaceutical companies were being used in executions, those companies decided it wasn't very good PR and wasn't good for overall sales of their other products, so they banned the drugs for this use. But so bloodthirsty were some states, they went about importing these drugs on the black market from shady pharmacies as far away as India, or having secretive compounding pharmacies in the U.S. manufacture the drugs for them. Other states decided to consider alternatives. Maybe let's go back to firing squads or electric chairs, since those worked so well in the past. But others stayed executions until they could find a suitable alternative to the drugs, a seemingly Manhattan Project-like endeavor for states like Oklahoma. And now comes news that they're tired of waiting, and they may resume executions with nitrogen gas as the first step. But it's never been used before in such a context, which makes it human experimentation. It's probably not a surprise that I'm anti-capital punishment. It doesn't make sense to me that in a time when there have been 161 exonerations of death row inmates and tales of rampant corruption in police departments and DA's offices across the country, we would still be comfortable with the state murdering incarcerated folks. And even if I was okay with that part of it, I would still be concerned about how people die and whether or not they are afforded basic human decency right up until the end. I know people will say, well, what about murderers? To that I say, how I treat other humans has little to do with who they are and what they've done, and everything to do with who I am. On the show today, the BQE needs some fixing, and fast. But will the state be on board to expedite the process? We'll find out with a local assembly member and a community leader. And then, dealing with youth violence and trauma in Brooklyn, how one doctor is trying to reduce both. But first, these things. On Sunday, Brooklyn teen Republicans demonstrated in front of the Bay Ridge office of Democratic State Assemblymember Pamela Harris, chanting, "Lock her up." The local politician had been indicted earlier in the year on 11 counts. Charges included wire fraud, making false statements in connection to allegedly misappropriating Hurricane Sandy relief funds, and using the money for vacations and lingerie. Harris pleaded not guilty to the charges, but the demonstrators are not content to wait for the trial. They focused on her. As president of the Teen Republicans, Batya Goldberg said, because corruption has no place in New York City and in Brooklyn. Goldberg also said that not only should Harris be put in jail, she should be banned from ever running for any elected office. Okay, not necessarily a bad idea. We should consider such laws. But just so we're sure that this is an anti-corruption campaign and not a partisan attack, I'll be looking for a similar statement from Goldberg about the candidacy of Republican and former felon Michael Grimm, who represents the same part of town and is vying again for federal office. Grimm was convicted for tax fraud and lying under oath. And he also, incidentally, hired undocumented immigrants despite calling for tougher immigration laws. He's running in the primary against incumbent Dan Donovan to win back his old 11th congressional district seat. Coming up, our first guest. Remember we told you a while back about the 21 bridges between Atlantic Avenue and Sand Street on the BQE? That's about a mile stretch that goes through Brooklyn Heights to downtown. And the fact that those bridges and that stretch of highway need repair. And if the repair doesn't happen soon, the city will have to ban trucks from that stretch, sending them rumbling through small and already congested surface roads. Bad news, I know. But the city determined they could fast-track the construction by using a process known as DesignBuild. The process, as with so many things in the city, requires state approval. Governor Cuomo has recently signed on, but it still has to pass the Senate. Here to talk to us in studio about this issue and how we might avoid calamity is Peter Bray, Executive Director of the Brooklyn Heights Association. Thank you for joining us, Peter. And via Skype from Albany, we have Joanne Simon, Assemblymember of District 52, which covers the part of town in question. Welcome to 112BK, Joanne.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, Peter, can you just tell me about this stretch of the BQE? What are the issues with it right now? Why is it in such desperate need of repair, especially in that stretch between Atlantic Avenue and Sand Street?
The BQE, the section that we're talking about, is also known as a triple cantilever. It's a very unique piece of engineering because there are three different levels with the eastbound and westbound lanes of the BQE, and sitting on top of that is the world-famous Brooklyn Heights Promenade with its views of Lower Manhattan. It was constructed back in the 40s. It opened in the early 50s, and it's been carrying increasing numbers of traffic daily. It's now up to 153,000 vehicles per day, of which about 16,000 are trucks. And it's a vital link for those vehicles and for a lot of those trucks to destinations within the city, as well as regionally going up to New England.
Right.
So it has to be maintained. It's falling apart. It was built to last 50 years. It's now almost 75 years old. And so it's at a critical point. Exactly.
We're a little overdue is what I'm hearing for these repairs.
Yes.
Joanne, can I ask you really quickly, if it needs fixing and the Department of Transportation is on it, there are a lot of people in the city who just think, hey, it needs fixing, so let's go fix it. Why doesn't it work that way?
Well, I think what you're referring to is the procurement process that the New York City has to follow. New York City's procurement process would normally have a design phase. Then they would decide who would design the work. The work would get designed. Then they would bid that out to somebody who would actually build it. Now, throughout the country, there is what we call DesignBuild, which eliminates that the design, then we bid it out to somebody to construct. And so it would be the same contractor or the group of contractors. There was always some sort of, group that would do the design and the construction planning at the same time. It saves a lot of time. In this case, it saves about 2 years, and those 2 years are very precious because, as Peter has said, this is waiting its intended life. Save 2 years, and in this case, they estimate $113 million, which could easily be more than that. So there's a big cost savings, and we can sure use that money some other places. And we need that. The city will have to put the truck from the roadway if it's not done by 2026. And if they don't go to design, we'll get 2026. So DesignBuild is here.
Joanne, what's the controversy with DesignBuild? Because there are some people who are not on board for that process. Why?
Well, I think that traditionally there have been issues about and whether or not this would be not giving an opportunity for more people to bid, for example, doing these jobs. So DesignBuild, it has been used by the state in a number of places, including locally in Brooklyn in the Kosciuszko Bridge. And the city, who is responsible for this stretch of the roadway, has in force a very significant project labor agreement. And so labor is on board. So that is not an issue here when it is with the BQE. But the state needs to authorize that because it's something that is a matter of state law to authorize it. And that's really, it's about getting this happening. We have been looking at doing this. I've been advocating for this now for several years. Now we are really at a critical point where it either happens now as design build or it doesn't happen. And I think that immediacy of that now is through now. And that you see that in the governor's support for the bill.
Right. Peter, is there anything you'd like to add about design build versus design bid build? Because, you know, as someone who, to be perfectly honest, like I'm new to the idea of on both sides, I'm thinking about it and I'm thinking, well, you know, the bidding process, you know, does that increase competition? Does it allow for the actual best design to rise to the top or for the best contractors to get that contract? Are we losing something in the process?
I think as Joanne pointed out, that design build is something that is seeing increasing use throughout the country. So there's no question in my mind that there's a recognition that design build is the best way of getting very complicated projects built, getting them built more quickly, and getting them built cheaper. And I think that ultimately, as communities and as taxpayers, that's really where our interest is, to see these projects done well, designed well, built as cost effectively as possible so that the benefits can be delivered to the public.
And that's design build. I'm hearing all of the benefits of design build as we talk about this over design build, and yet there is still opposition, which makes me wonder, is there some political motivation behind that opposition? And how does that affect, you know, how soon we're going to see the repairs here for the BQE?
Well, I think Joanne has better insight into
Joanne,
the political
help us
process,
out.
but let me just say that we spent a day in Albany last week, and we had conversations with a lot of Joanne's colleagues, both on the Assembly side and on the Senate side. We met with the governor's senior transportation people, and one of the things that I learned was that the legislature has authorized state agencies to use design build, but only in increments of 2 years. And this is very unusual across the country. So I think that my sense is that design build is being used as a kind of a bargaining chip between the legislature and the governor in order to get other political objectives satisfied. I think that's one of the factors here.
Wow. Wow. Joanne, did you have any thoughts on that?
So I think that, you know, almost anything can be a part of a bargaining chip in Albany. I think that what we're seeing here that is different and perhaps not as well known, and that is that whatever those objections, theoretical objections may be, or prospective objections that may exist more broadly. You know, I know the governor, for example, wants to extend design build to all local governments and municipalities. The reality is that other areas, you know, upstate, Long Island, they have different politics, they have different labor issues, they may have differences of opinion, but we have this immediacy with the BQE, if nothing else, and a few other projects in the city. And so what I think is important for viewers to know is that this is the support for design build for the city, particularly for the BQE and some other projects, is, you know, bipartisan and bicameral. Every senator in Brooklyn and Queens has signed on to support this. The bill in the Senate is carried by Senator Golden from Bay Ridge, who is a Republican, and Senator Lanza from Staten Island, who is a Republican. And all the other senators have signed on. Every assembly member in the corridor has signed on to this. And that is, you know, so again, it's bipartisan, bicameral. So there really is no objection that I can see to doing this, except that part of this is now, it's within the budget process. Now, there's no cost to the state for the city to do design build. So, because the state's not contributing to it. But the budget process is a way to hammer home other parts of policy and of authority. This is basically just giving the city authority to spend its money wisely. So that the budget happens when it happens, and so we're part of that mix. We're feeling more confident that this will happen, but of course, until it's done, it's not done, and so that's why we are not resting until that happens.
Is there any opposition coming from upstate?
Well, you know, we have not identified any opposition from upstate. I do know that that would be a different picture. Were this to be DesignBuild in their location, there might be some different opinions, right? But this is really just about allowing the city of New York to do the best job, to make sure that when they start the design, the construction people are there with them to say, hey, you know what, looks great, but from a building point of view, this has issues. Why don't we tweak it this way? That's kind of the beauty of DesignBuild, is that the team is there together and can resolve those issues, so you don't have change orders later on. You don't end up spending money litigating those kinds of things later on. I don't see anybody, I don't know of anybody upstate who's opposing the city doing that. It may be that they are, but we haven't identified that.
Well, if it doesn't make it into the budget, what does that mean for downtown Brooklyn? What does that mean for this already congested area?
Well, I think it's going to be a disaster, because the point about being in the budget, you know, we could pass this as a standalone bill, because again, it doesn't cost the state anything. So that's feasible, but it's about timing. The city has to let an RFP to do this work now. They have to do it this spring. It's their last opportunity to be able to have that bid out and start this process before we have a roadway fall off the cliff. Right? It's as simple as that. So now's the time to do it. If they don't do it now, they're not going to be able to do it.
Peter, what are your thoughts on that?
I just want to amplify what Joanne was saying. It would be a disaster. It'd be a catastrophe. We're talking about putting 16,000 huge trucks onto our streets, and even though the city says that there are certain truck routes that they can go on, we know that they're going to find any route possible to get to their destination as quickly as possible. So they're going to be on narrow Brooklyn streets. We've already seen examples of terrible tragedies that have occurred in our communities where people have been hurt or killed. So we have that danger. We have added air pollution, and we also have these trucks increasing the already high rates of asthma that exist in many of the communities in Brooklyn. So we really have to get this done in the next few weeks, so that we avoid this terrible prospect that I've outlined.
Well, Peter and Joanne, thank you so much for being here. I'm so sorry we've run out of time, but I really, really appreciate your time for explaining this issue that affects a lot of people, but not everybody has a firm grasp on. Hopefully we'll have you back to talk about what it looks like when they're actually working on it.
We'll be happy to come back. Thank you, Ashley.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To my block party. Welcome to my block party. Welcome to my block party. Welcome to my block party. Say, let's go, 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 and welcome to my block party.
Kids are impulsive, that we know. We also know that teens are more likely to experience trauma due to this impulsiveness. Recent stats show that teens in the city are responsible for and victims of shootings at an alarming and disproportionate rate. Dealing with this kind of violence, trying to short-circuit it before it erupts and deal with its aftermath is what our next guest does when he doesn't have his hands full in the Kings County Hospital ER. We welcome to the show Dr. Rob Gore, Executive Director of Kings Against Violence Initiative, or KAVI. Thanks for coming on 112.
Thanks for having me.
Can you just explain to me really quickly what KAVI is?
So KAVI itself is, we're a violence intervention and prevention program that's hospital, school, and community-based, but if you were to really kind of narrow it down to what we are a safe space. And the goal is to make sure that we can keep young people safe by providing opportunities that help take them out of the streets and help provide resources to help get them to that next level. And when you look at violence and trauma and why it happens and why certain communities are more marginalized than others, it really boils down to resources, the haves and the have-nots. And when you're in a position and, ultimately, like our goal is to really survive, and, across the planet, people want to survive. But if you don't have basic needs like food, clothing, shelter, and security, that becomes compromised. And when your resources become compromised, how you deal with day-to-day situations also takes a turn. And
We call that survival mode.
survival mode is key in these instances. And we want to make sure that we help equip young people with tools that are going to allow them to move to that next level beyond survival mode.
Tell me about the temper coolers, because I know that that's something that you guys do where you have someone sort of, ease when something happens to someone, when there's an assault, when there's a shooting, when there's some violence. You have someone go have a conversation with the person trying to prevent retaliation. Can you talk to me about how much violence is actually retaliation for something that happened before?
Right. So, like if you just look at homicide stats and violence stats, if somebody's been shot before, that rate of re-injury is as high as 45–50% within 5 years after that initial trauma.
Wow.
And the homicide rate is as high as 20% within 5 years after that initial trauma. So you're dealing with large numbers, and look at how many people have been affected by Ebola in the United States. How many people are infected with the flu virus? And then you look at, what numbers people have as far as getting injured, and then the likelihood of them having them re-injured again within 5 years. And those numbers are astronomical. And the reason, when you start looking at that stuff, we're trying to reframe the conversation from looking at violence itself as this social issue, but looking at more of this public health related problem with identifiable risk factors that, if we can intervene and prevent some of those risk factors from occurring in the first place, we can really change the tides and how violence and conflict is affecting people within our communities. But our numbers are high. You've got more than 500,000 reported violent incidents involving young people between the ages of 10 and 24 around the United States. And those are only the ones that we see.
Wow. What about in Brooklyn?
In Brooklyn itself, wow. Our hospital itself at Kings County, I'm in both Kings County and downstate, but Kings County is the trauma center. We'll have more than a couple hundred gunshot wounds, maybe more than 200 gunshot wounds per year coming into the emergency department. And that's not including stab wounds. That's not including blunt trauma, like if somebody's been hit with a pipe or a bat, or even been jumped with fists and kicked. But like, we realize it's a problem. One, for me personally, this is where I live. I live in Bed-Stuy. I grew up in Brooklyn, and when you're a person of color, we can't just go to other communities and live. It happens in our neighborhoods, whether we're middle class or upper middle class.
Yes.
It just impacts us in ways that it doesn't always impact other people who might live in a more isolated community.
Right. And have more choices about where they would feel comfortable relocating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We don't always have those options. Plus, some of us want to make sure that we are in positions to help rebuild and build up the community into what we know it has the potential to be. And so we don't want to leave and say, wow, this is somebody else's problem. Let me
This
move
is
away.
interesting to me, because this is something that you hear about a lot in these communities, not just with people of color, with people of certain socioeconomic status, and it's these cycles, right? The cycle of poverty, the cycle of abuse. There's also a cycle of violence. How do you even begin to interrupt a cycle of violence in a community?
So the first thing, it starts off with, what is the problem that we're trying to deal with? Like, what's our ultimate goal? We know that this community may experience high levels of violence, but to tell somebody to stop fighting, but fighting is your way to make sure that you stay alive, is not really realistic. And so you've got to start getting at the root cause of violence in the first place. Looking at, again, having your basic needs being met. Those who have access to resources may not always be in the same positions to engage in violent conflict compared to those who don't.
Right.
And so like social determinants of health, things like education, things like poverty, community economics, these are all things that tend to contribute to high cycles of violence. And I gave a talk in Turkey about maybe 4 years ago, and I was talking with some docs who were in Istanbul, and they said, we don't see violence the way that you see it in the United States, at least not in Istanbul. We see high rates of domestic violence, but we do see those rates of violence in the border states, in the refugee camps, places where you have the haves and the have-nots, and you really like have that sharp demarcation.
Right.
And again, you think about what resources mean and how the lack of resources or one community having access to more and one community having access to less, like how that whole thing plays around with conflict.
How does KAVI address that? Like, that's the thing, right? Because that's the whole goal of KAVI. How are you guys addressing that right now?
All right. The first thing in terms of just establishing our core value, we want to make sure we are in a position to provide opportunities for young people.
Right.
That's one goal. The other thing is we want to make sure that people live. We want vitality is important. We can't even have these other conversations about economic growth and development if we can't even get people to the point that they can understand, or we can help them understand that you are important, you are valued, and you have a right to live.
Yes.
And so those are a couple of core things that we address early on. There are three different aspects of our program. We have our hospital-based intervention, where we help provide follow-up and case management and wraparound services for people who've been shot and stabbed, because they do have a high rate of recurrence. And so we work with patients, we work with their families, and help link them up to a lot of the psychosocial support systems that exist within the hospital corporation at Kings County or downstate, or the surrounding community. We also do that work in conjunction with a couple of other amazing community-based organizations like Man Up Incorporated out in East New York, SOS in Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy, GMAC, Gangsters Making Astronomical Community Changes over out in East Flatbush, and even the GDLU program that's affiliated with the hospital corporation.
Wow.
So that's one aspect of that, making sure that patients who've been affected and impacted and their families have access to resources. The second and third components are our school programming and our community programming. We have close to 250 young people that we work with in our school and community programs. We're based out in East Flatbush at the Wingate High School Education Complex, which is the old Wingate High School campus. And we're also at Eagle Academy in Brownsville, providing in-school programming for young people who are considered to be impacted by violence. If you live in Brooklyn,
Unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Sorry,
and no, that's not your problem. This is just fascinating, and I want more and more people to learn about it. How do people find out more about KAVI?
you can check us out at KAVIBrooklyn.org. That's KAVIBROOKLYN.org for more information. And if you want, we do workshops, we do trainings for community groups, educators, concerned citizens, and you just look us up and check us out and get in touch with us.
I hope more people do. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much.
I really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us. Next week, we'll be back with the founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, some badass women activists, and a preview of our March 21st town hall meeting called Be Heard, Me Too is Just the Beginning. See you then.